The lawyer's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Elena Marsh sat frozen in the leather chair, her fingers gripping the armrests, as the man across the desk read out the number that would decide the rest of her life. $600,000. That was what her father owed. That was the debt that had been hiding behind his tired smile for the last 3 years. The debt he never once mentioned during their quiet dinners, or their long walks by the river. Henry Marsh sat beside his daughter, his hands trembling in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor like a man waiting for a judge to announce his sentence. He had built his small furniture business from nothing, had poured every coin and every hour into it, and somewhere along the way, the numbers had turned against him. Loans he could not repay, investors who wanted their money back with interest that grew heavier every month. And now, sitting in this cold office with marble floors and tall glass windows, the truth had finally caught up to him. The lawyer, a thin man named Gerald Finch, folded his hands and looked at Elena with something close to pity. "There is one option," he said carefully, "before the company files for full seizure of your father's assets, including your family home." Elena's heart pounded. What option? Gerald slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and at the top of it was a name that made the air leave her lungs. Damian Cole. Everyone in the city knew that name. He owned half the buildings downtown, controlled shipping routes that stretched across 3 countries, and had a reputation so sharp that people lowered their voices when they spoke about him. Ruthless, they called him, cold, a man who had never lost a negotiation in his life. "Mr. Cole has agreed to settle your father's entire debt," Gerald said, "in exchange for one condition." Elena's hands went cold before she even heard the words. "What condition?" "He wants a wife. For 1 year, you would live with him, share his home, and in return, your father walks away free, with his business intact and his name cleared." For a moment, the room seemed to spin. Elena looked at her father, hoping he would refuse immediately, hoping he would stand up and say this was madness, that no daughter should be traded like property to settle a debt. But when she looked at him, she saw something worse than anger. She saw defeat. His shoulders had already given up before his mouth could form the words. "Elena," he whispered, "I would never ask this of you. I would rather lose everything than see you trapped in something you don't want." But Elena knew her father. She knew that if she said no, he would carry this shame to his grave, that the stress alone might finally break the heart that had already grown weak from years of worry. She thought of the house she grew up in, the small kitchen where her mother used to hum while cooking, the garden her father built with his own hands after her mother passed away. She thought of everything that would vanish if she refused. "I'll do it," she said, before she could stop herself. Gerald did not look surprised. He simply nodded, as though he had expected this answer all along, and began explaining the terms of the agreement. Full financial security for her father, a private contract, signed and sealed, with no room for negotiation once it was in effect. Elena barely heard half of what he said. Her mind was already racing ahead, imagining the man she was about to marry, a man she had never met, a man whose name alone made grown business owners flinch. 3 days later, she stood in front of a grand estate on the outskirts of the city, her small suitcase in hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house looked less like a home and more like a fortress, with iron gates and stone walls that seemed to swallow the last bit of courage she had left. A woman in a neat gray uniform opened the door before Elena could even knock. "You must be Miss Marsh," the woman said kindly. "I'm Grace. I manage the household. Mr. Cole is expecting you." Elena followed her through a hallway lined with paintings, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Every part of the house whispered wealth, but none of it felt warm. It felt like walking into a museum where nothing was meant to be touched. Damian Cole was standing by the window in his study when Elena entered, his back to her, his tall frame outlined by the fading evening light. When he turned around, Elena expected to see the cold, calculating man everyone described. Instead, she found herself staring into a pair of tired eyes that held something heavier than arrogance, something that looked almost like regret. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice low and steady. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much of a choice," Elena replied, unable to hide the edge in her tone. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "No," he admitted. "I suppose you didn't. I'm sorry for that." She had not expected an apology. It threw her off balance more than any harsh word could have. "Well, the wedding will be small," he continued. "Just enough witnesses to make it legal. After that, you'll live here, in this house, as my wife, for 1 year. Your father's debt will be cleared the moment we sign the papers. Beyond that, I will not ask anything of you that you are not ready to give." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the trap she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his words. "And what happens in this house? Behind closed doors?" Damien held her gaze without flinching. "Nothing happens that you don't want to happen. I am not in the business of forcing people, Miss Marsh. Whatever this arrangement becomes, it will become that because you choose it, not because I demand it." She did not know whether to believe him. Every story she had heard about Damien Cole painted him as a man who took what he wanted without apology, but the man standing in front of her did not match those stories at all. The wedding took place 2 days later, in a small chapel with only Grace, Gerald, and a handful of Damien's closest associates present. Elena wore a simple white dress her father had helped her choose, fighting back tears the entire time, though she could not tell if they came from grief, or fear, or something she did not yet have a name for. When Damien slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady, but his eyes carried the same uncertainty hers did. That night, Elena sat on the edge of the large bed, in what was now her bedroom, waiting for whatever was supposed to come next, her whole body tense with dread. When Damien finally entered the room, he did not move toward her the way she expected. Instead, he sat down in the armchair across from the bed, keeping a careful distance between them. "You look like you're bracing for something terrible," he said quietly. "Aren't I supposed to be?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien shook his head slowly. "Not tonight. Not unless you want something to happen. I told you the truth in my study, and I meant every word of it." Elena studied him, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the cold businessman everyone warned her about to finally show himself. But he simply rose from the chair, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the handle. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out how this is supposed to work." And then he was gone, leaving Elena alone in the enormous bedroom, staring at the closed door, more confused than she had been in her entire life. She had walked into this marriage expecting cruelty, expecting to be treated as nothing more than a payment for her father's mistakes. Instead, she found a man who spoke softly, who kept his distance, who seemed almost afraid of hurting her. She did not sleep much that night. Every sound in the house made her sit up, certain that everything Damien said had been a lie meant to lower her guard. But no one came. The house stayed silent, except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of old wood settling into the night. The next morning, Elena woke to the smell of fresh coffee and found breakfast already set on the table in her room. A small note sat beside the plate, written in neat, careful handwriting. "Eat first, then come find me in the garden if you're willing. No pressure either way." She read the note twice, trying to understand the man who had written it. After a long moment of hesitation, she got dressed and made her way downstairs, following the sound of soft footsteps and the smell of blooming flowers, until she found Damien standing near a row of white roses, his sleeves rolled up, a pair of gardening shears in his hand. "You garden?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "My mother used to," he said, not looking up from the roses. "It's one of the few things I remember clearly about her. I kept the garden going after she passed. It felt wrong to let it die with her." There was something raw in the way he said it, something that made Elena forget, for just a moment, that this man was supposed to be her enemy. She stepped closer, watching him work, and for the first time since stepping into this house, she felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just slightly. "Why did you really want a wife?" she asked. "You could have paid off my father's debt without marrying me. You have more money than most countries." Damien's hands paused over the roses. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Elena thought he might refuse to answer, but then he straightened up and looked at her directly. "That's a longer story," he said. "One I'm not ready to tell yet. But I promise you, Elena, it wasn't about controlling you. It never will be." It was the first time he had used her first name, and something about the way he said it made her chest tighten in a way she did not understand. She wanted to press him further, to demand the truth right then and there, but something in his eyes told her this was not the moment. Whatever secret he was carrying, it was heavy enough to make even a man like Damian Cole look tired. Over the following days, Elena began to notice small things about her new husband. He never raised his voice, even when Grace made mistakes in the household schedule. He read every night before bed, always the same worn copy of an old novel, its spine cracked from years of use. He avoided mirrors, as though he did not like what he saw reflected back at him. And every morning, without fail, he left a small note somewhere she would find it, never demanding anything, only offering small kindnesses that felt strange coming from a man with his reputation. One evening, as Elena sat alone in the study reading, Damian entered quietly and took the seat across from her without a word. For a while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them. "You don't have to keep your distance from me all the time," Elena finally said, breaking the quiet. "I won't bite." A small, rare smile tugged at the corner of Damian's mouth. "I'm not worried about you biting," he said. "I'm worried about scaring you away before you've had a chance to know me properly." "And why does that matter to you?" she asked. "This is a business arrangement. 1 year, and then we go our separate ways." Damian's smile faded, replaced by something more solemn. "Maybe," he said. "But I'd rather spend that year with someone who doesn't flinch every time I walk into a room. I don't expect you to fall in love with me, Elena. I just don't want you to be afraid." She did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and returned to her book, though her eyes no longer moved across the words. Her mind was too busy trying to piece together the puzzle sitting across from her, a man who was supposed to be cold and calculating, but who spent his evenings reading quietly by the fire, worried about frightening the woman he had married under such strange circumstances. As the days turned into a week, Elena found herself watching Damian more closely, searching for the cruelty everyone warned her about, but finding only careful patience instead. He asked about her day. He remembered small details she mentioned only once, like her love for lemon tea over regular tea, or the way she always hummed her mother's favorite song when she was nervous. He never crossed the boundaries he had promised not to cross, and slowly, without realizing it, Elena began to lower the walls she had built around herself the moment she stepped through his front door. But even as her fear began to fade, a new question took its place. If this man was capable of such gentleness, such quiet consideration, then why did the rest of the world fear him so much? What had happened to build the reputation that made grown men avoid meeting his eyes in business meetings? Elena had a feeling that whatever answer waited behind that question, it would not be simple, and it would not be easy to hear. For now, she decided to let the mystery rest. She had 1 year ahead of her in this house, 1 year to learn the truth about the man she had married, and despite everything that had brought her here, despite the fear and uncertainty that still lingered in the corners of her mind, Elena found herself curious about what the coming months might reveal. Not just about Damian Cole, but about herself, and about a heart she thought she understood completely, until the moment she met a man who refused to fit into the box everyone else had built for him. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her, Elena realized something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened since she arrived. For the first time in weeks, she was not afraid of tomorrow. She was curious about it. And in a house built on secrets and silence, curiosity felt like the most dangerous thing of all. The following morning, a knock at her door pulled her from a light sleep. It was not Grace with breakfast, but Damian himself, standing in the doorway with an expression she had not seen on him before, something almost hesitant. "I have to leave for a business trip," he said. 3 days. Grace will take care of everything you need, but I wanted to tell you myself before I left." "Why does that matter?" Elena asked, sitting up in bed, still half asleep. Damian hesitated, his hand tightening slightly on the doorframe. "Because I didn't want you to wake up and think I disappeared without a word. I know trust doesn't come easily in this situation. I'd like to earn it anyway." He left before she could respond, and Elena sat in her bed for a long moment after the door closed, staring at the empty space where he had been standing. 3 days without him in the house felt strange, almost unsettling, though she could not understand why. She barely knew this man, and yet, in the space of a single week, he had already become someone whose absence she noticed. She spent those 3 days wandering the halls of the enormous house, discovering rooms she had not yet explored, a library filled with books that smelled of old paper and ink, a music room with a piano covered in a thin layer of dust, as though no one had played it in years. She found an old photograph tucked into one of the shelves, a young boy standing beside a woman with kind eyes, both of them smiling at the camera. She recognized the boy immediately by his eyes, Damien, no older than 8, standing beside a woman who could only be his mother. Something about the photograph tugged at her heart. The boy in the picture looked nothing like the guarded man she had come to know. He looked free, happy, untouched by whatever had happened to build the walls he now hid behind. When Damien returned 3 days later, tired from his trip, but carrying a small package wrapped in simple brown paper, he found Elena in the music room, sitting at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. "You play?" he asked from the doorway. "I used to," she said, "before things got complicated at home." He crossed the room and set the package down beside her. "I saw this and thought of you," he said simply. Inside the paper was a small book of sheet music, filled with songs Elena had loved as a child, songs she had not heard in years. Her throat tightened as she flipped through the pages, overwhelmed by the simple, thoughtful gesture from a man who barely knew her. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "You mentioned it once," Damien said. "The first night we spoke. I don't forget things that matter." Elena looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the ruthless man everyone described, and found nothing but quiet sincerity staring back at her. In that moment, sitting together in a dusty music room filled with forgotten songs, Elena understood that whatever this year held for her, it would not be simple. It would not be easy. But for the first time since stepping into this strange, guarded house, she felt something close to hope, fragile and uncertain, but real all the same. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered that the real story was only just beginning. The days that followed carried a different rhythm than the ones before Damien left. Elena noticed it the moment he returned, a small shift, subtle, but unmistakable, like a door left slightly open, where before there had only been walls. He began seeking her out more often, finding small reasons to be in the same room, offering little comments about her day, asking questions that felt less like polite formality and more like genuine curiosity. One afternoon, she found him in the kitchen of all places, attempting to make tea the way she liked it, using the small notes he had apparently been keeping about her preferences without her knowledge. He looked almost embarrassed when she caught him, standing there with a kettle in one hand and a jar of honey in the other. "I didn't realize you knew how to boil water," Elena teased, leaning against the doorway with a smile she could not quite hide. Damien's lips twitched upward. "I have many hidden talents, Miss Marsh. Or perhaps I should say, Mrs. Cole now." The name still felt strange on her ears, foreign and unfamiliar, but hearing him say it with a hint of warmth instead of formality made something flutter nervously in her chest. "You've been keeping notes about me," she said, nodding toward the small notebook sitting open on the counter, filled with his careful handwriting. His cheeks colored slightly, an unusual sight on a man who always seemed so composed. "I didn't want to forget the things that mattered to you," he admitted. "It felt important, given everything." Elena crossed the kitchen and picked up the notebook, scanning the neat list of small details. Her favorite color, the songs she hummed while cooking, the way she took her coffee in the morning but preferred tea in the evening. Small things, insignificant to most people, but carefully recorded by a man the world believed incapable of gentleness. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked softly, looking up at him. Damien set the kettle down and met her gaze directly. "Because you didn't choose this life, Elena. You didn't choose me. The least I can do is make sure you don't regret every single day of it." Something about his honesty disarmed her completely. She had spent so long preparing for cruelty, for coldness, for the kind of treatment she had heard about in whispered stories, that she had no defense prepared for kindness instead. It left her feeling exposed in a way she was not used to, vulnerable in a manner that both frightened and comforted her at once. That evening, As the sun began to set over the garden, Damien found her sitting outside among the roses, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the colors shift across the sky. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the stone bench. She nodded, and he settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but careful to leave enough space that she never felt crowded. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said after a long moment of comfortable silence. "Of course." "Why does everyone fear you so much? I've heard the stories, Damien. Ruthless, cold, heartless. But that's not the man I've been living with this past week." Damien's expression shifted, something guarded flickering behind his eyes before he forced it away. "People fear what they don't understand," he said carefully. "In business, showing weakness gets you destroyed. I learned that lesson a long time ago, in a way I'm not ready to talk about yet. So I built walls, high enough that no one could see past them, strong enough that no one could tear them down. And yet you're sitting here with me, talking about it," Elena pointed out. A faint, almost sad smile crossed his face. "You're different," he said simply. "I don't know why yet, but you are." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to fully unpack. Elena felt her heart pounding in her chest, confused by the warmth spreading through her, confused by how quickly her fear of this man had transformed into something far more complicated. As the last light faded from the sky, they sat together in silence, two strangers bound by circumstance, slowly becoming something neither of them had expected. Elena did not know what the coming months would bring, could not predict the secrets still waiting to be uncovered, or the truths that would eventually shake the fragile peace they had built. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by roses and fading sunlight, she allowed herself to simply exist in the present, free from fear, for the first time since this entire journey began. Little did she know, the walls Damien had built were not the only secrets hiding in this house. And the closer she grew to him, the more dangerous those secrets would become, waiting patiently in the shadows for the moment they would finally come to light. The phone rang at midnight, and Elena woke to find the other side of the bed already empty. She sat up, her heart racing before she even understood why, some instinct telling her something was wrong. She wrapped a robe around herself and stepped into the hallway, following the low murmur of Damien's voice coming from the study. She stopped just outside the door, unable to stop herself from listening. His voice was different than she had ever heard it, sharp and controlled in a way that sent a chill down her spine. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "Make sure it doesn't reach her. Not now. Not yet." Elena's stomach twisted. Who was he talking about? Was it her? She pushed the door open before she could think better of it, and Damien turned sharply, his eyes widening for just a moment, before the calm mask settled back over his face. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, ending the call without waiting for a response. "Who was that?" Elena asked, crossing her arms over her chest, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt standing there in her robe. "Business," Damien said, but the tightness in his jaw told her there was more to it. "You said someone shouldn't reach me." "Reach me with what, Damien?" For a long moment, he said nothing, simply staring at her with an expression caught somewhere between guilt and fear. It was the fear that surprised her the most. She had never once seen this man look afraid, not since the day she arrived in this house. "It's complicated," he finally said, "and it isn't the right time to explain it." "When will it be the right time?" Elena pressed, stepping further into the room. "You keep saying that, Damien. Every time I ask about your past, about why people fear you, about whatever secret you're carrying. When exactly is the right time going to arrive?" Damien ran a hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration cracking through his usual composure. "Soon," he said. "I promise you. Soon. But not tonight. Please, Elena. Trust me a little longer." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers right then and there, but something in the exhaustion etched across his face stopped her. Instead, she simply nodded, though the unease in her chest refused to fade. Over the following days, Elena noticed small changes in Damien's behavior. He grew more careful, more watchful, as though bracing for something he could not fully explain. He began locking his study door, something he had never done before. He canceled 2 meetings that Grace mentioned in passing, meetings he had apparently been looking forward to for weeks. One morning, while Damien was out handling business matters in the city, Elena found herself standing outside his study, staring at the locked door with a mixture of guilt and determination. She knew she shouldn't. She knew that whatever secrets lay behind that door were his to share, not hers to uncover. But the not knowing had become unbearable, gnawing at her every waking thought. Grace found her standing there, a curious expression crossing her kind face. "Looking for something, Mrs. Cole?" Elena startled, quickly stepping away from the door. "No, I was just thinking." Grace studied her for a long moment before glancing around, as though checking that no one else could hear them. "You've noticed the change in him, haven't you, since the phone call?" Elena's heart skipped. "You know about it?" Grace hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her employer and sympathy for the young woman standing before her. "It's not my place to say," she said carefully, "but I will tell you this, Mrs. Cole. Whatever Mr. Cole is protecting you from, he's doing it because he cares more than you realize. This house has seen darker days than the ones you've witnessed so far." The words did little to ease Elena's worry, but they planted a seed of understanding that had not been there before. Whatever was happening, whatever shadow loomed over this house, Damien was not hiding it out of cruelty. He was hiding it out of some misguided attempt at protection. That evening, Damien returned home later than usual, his expression tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. Elena found him in the garden, standing among the roses in the fading light, his shoulders heavier than she had ever seen them. "Rough day?" she asked gently, approaching him slowly. He turned, and for a moment, the walls he usually kept so carefully in place seemed to crumble entirely. "You could say that," he admitted. "Talk to me," Elena said. "Not about the secrets. Not yet. If you're not ready. Just talk to me. About anything." Something shifted in his expression, a quiet gratitude replacing the exhaustion for just a moment. He sat down on the stone bench, and after a brief hesitation, Elena joined him. "When I was young," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "my family lost everything. Not slowly, like most families. All at once. One decision, one betrayal, and suddenly we had nothing. I watched my mother work herself into the ground trying to keep us afloat. Watched my father disappear into bottles and empty promises, until he wasn't really there anymore, even when he was standing right in front of us." Elena stayed silent, sensing that any interruption might cause him to close off completely. "I promised myself I would never let that happen again," Damien continued. "I promised I would build something so strong, so untouchable, that no one could ever take it away from me. And I did. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to let anyone close enough to actually enjoy what I built." "Until now?" Elena asked softly. Damien looked at her, something vulnerable and unguarded in his eyes. "Until now," he confirmed. The confession hung between them, fragile and honest, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel for a man who had entered her life through such complicated circumstances. She reached out, hesitantly, and placed her hand over his on the bench. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "even just that much." Damien turned his hand over, gently lacing his fingers with hers, and for a long moment, they simply sat together in the quiet garden, two people slowly learning to trust each other, despite everything working against them. But even as the moment stretched on, warm and peaceful, Elena could not shake the feeling that whatever secret still remained hidden behind that locked study door was far more dangerous than a simple story of childhood poverty. Something in the way Grace had spoken, something in the fear that flickered behind Damien's eyes during that midnight phone call, told her that the real truth was still waiting, patient and heavy, just beyond her reach. The following week, Damien surprised her with an invitation to accompany him to a business dinner, the first time he had asked her to join him for anything related to his work. Elena spent the afternoon nervously preparing, uncertain what to expect from the world Damien usually kept so carefully separate from their home life. The restaurant was elegant, filled with the kind of quiet luxury that made Elena acutely aware of every move she made. Damien introduced her to several of his associates, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, his voice carrying a warmth she had not heard him use with anyone outside their home. It was during dessert that everything changed. A man approached their table, his smile too wide, his eyes too calculating for Elena's comfort. Damien's entire posture shifted the moment he saw him, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Victor," Damien said, his voice carefully controlled, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I go where the interesting people are," Victor replied smoothly, his gaze sliding toward Elena with an expression that made her skin crawl. "And who is this lovely woman? I don't believe we've met." "My wife," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for further questions. Victor's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Wife?" I hadn't heard the great Damien Cole had settled down. How very convenient timing. The words carried a weight Elena did not fully understand, but she saw the way Damien's jaw tightened, the way his hand found hers under the table and squeezed gently, as though silently asking her to trust him a little longer. "If you'll excuse us," Damien said, "we were just finishing our evening." Victor's smile did not waver, but his eyes carried a warning that sent a chill through Elena's chest. "Of course," he said. "Do give my regards to your father's memory, Damien. I'm sure he would be proud of how far you've come." The comment landed like a blow, and Elena watched Damien's composure crack for just a fraction of a second before he pulled it back into place. Victor walked away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. "Who was that?" Elena asked once they were finally alone, driving home in the quiet darkness. Damien's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Someone from my past," he said. "Someone I hoped I would never have to deal with again." "Damien, please. I saw your face when he mentioned your father." What did he mean? For a long moment, Damien said nothing. The only sound in the car, the quiet hum of the engine, and the distant noise of the city passing by outside the window. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father didn't just disappear into bottles, Elena. He made a decision, right before he died, that changed everything. A decision involving your mother." Elena's world tilted sideways. "My mother?" Damien's eyes stayed fixed on the road, refusing to meet hers. "There's a debt," he said quietly. "One that goes back further than you realize. Further than your father's business failures. I need you to trust me a little longer, Elena. I promise. The truth is coming, but not tonight. Please." Elena stared at him, 1,000 questions racing through her mind, but something in his exhausted, pleading expression told her that pushing further would only cause more damage than good. She nodded slowly, though the unease in her chest had grown into something far heavier than before. Whatever connection existed between their families, whatever secret bound Damien's past to her own mother's memory, Elena understood now that this marriage was never simply about her father's debt. There was a deeper story here, one that stretched back years before she was even born, and she had a growing feeling that the truth, when it finally arrived, would change everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Damien's steady breathing beside her, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would wait for the truth, as he asked, but she would not wait forever. Whatever secret remained hidden behind his careful walls, she intended to uncover it, one way or another, before this year of forced marriage came to its uncertain end. Grace found the old photograph the next morning, tucked between the pages of a book Elena had left on the living room table. She held it out without a word, her expression unreadable, and Elena felt her breath catch the moment she saw it. Two young women stood together in front of a small house, laughing, their arms wrapped around each other like sisters. One of them was unmistakably her mother, younger than Elena had ever seen her, her smile wide and unguarded. The other woman, Elena did not recognize at first, until she noticed the eyes, Damien's eyes. "Where did you find this?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It fell out of one of the old books in the library," Grace said carefully. "I believe that's Mr. Cole's mother standing beside yours." Elena stared at the photograph for a long time, her mind racing to piece together what this meant. Her mother and Damien's mother had known each other, had been close, judging by the easy affection captured in the image. And yet, in all the years Elena had known her mother, she had never once mentioned a friend by that name, never spoken of any connection to the Cole family. She found Damien in his study later that afternoon, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. He looked up when she entered, and the moment his eyes landed on the picture, all the color drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice tight. "Grace found it," Elena said. "Damien, that's my mother. With your mother. Why have you never mentioned this? Why does everyone keep dancing around whatever connects our families?" Damien rose slowly from his desk, crossing the room to take the photograph from her hands with careful, almost reverent fingers. He stared at it for a long moment, something painful flickering behind his eyes. "They were best friends," he finally said, "since childhood. Inseparable, from what my mother used to tell me. They made promises to each other, the kind young girls make when they think the future is simple and kind." "What kind of promises?" Damien set the photograph down on his desk, running a hand through his hair. "My mother promised that if anything ever happened to her, our families would look out for each other, and your mother made the same promise. It was the kind of thing people say without ever expecting to have to keep it." "But something happened," Elena said, piecing the puzzle together slowly. "Something that made someone have to keep that promise." Damien's jaw tightened. "My father made a terrible decision before he died, a business decision that nearly destroyed everything my mother had left. Your mother helped us, quietly, without asking for anything in return. She used money she couldn't really afford to spare, just to keep my mother and me from losing our home." Elena's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and confusion. Her mother had never mentioned any of this, not once, in all the years before she passed away. "When my mother died," Damien continued, his voice growing quieter, "she made me promise that if the Marsh family ever needed help, I would be there, no questions asked. I made that promise not knowing it would eventually mean stepping in when your father's business began to fail." Elena felt the pieces click together all at once, and yet the picture they formed was more complicated than she expected. "So this marriage," she said slowly, "it wasn't just about my father's debt. It was about keeping a promise your mother made to mine." "At first," Damien admitted. "That's the truth, Elena. I won't lie to you about that. When Gerald first came to me about your father's situation, I saw an opportunity to finally keep the promise I made to my mother. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about promises and debts." "Then what is it about now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien stepped closer, close enough that she could see the honesty written clearly across his face. "You," he said simply. "It became about you, about wanting to know you, to understand you, to make sure that whatever happens after this year ends, you walk away knowing that at least one part of this arrangement was real." The confession hung heavy in the air between them, and Elena found herself struggling to breathe properly. Part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to feel used and manipulated by a promise made before she was even born, but another part of her, a part growing stronger every day, understood the weight of what he was telling her. He had entered this marriage carrying a debt of honor, and somewhere along the way, that debt had transformed into something neither of them had expected. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" she asked. "Because I was afraid," Damien admitted. "Afraid you would see this as nothing more than an obligation, that you would never believe anything I felt for you was genuine, once you learned the truth about how it all started." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, but found only quiet vulnerability staring back at her. "I need time," she finally said, "to think about all of this." Damien nodded slowly, though the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to hide completely. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I meant what I said, Elena. I'm not going anywhere." Over the following days, Elena found herself replaying every conversation, every gesture, every quiet moment they had shared since her arrival in this house. She thought about the notebook filled with small details about her preferences, the book of sheet music, the careful way he had learned to read her moods without ever pushing too hard. None of that felt like obligation. None of that felt like a man simply fulfilling a promise made by his dying mother. She found herself in the library one evening, searching through old books for any other traces of her mother's connection to this family, when she stumbled upon a small leather journal tucked into the back of a shelf. The handwriting inside was unmistakably her mother's, and Elena's hands trembled as she began to read. The entries spoke of a friendship deeper than Elena had ever imagined, filled with stories of two young women navigating hardship together, supporting each other through losses and struggles that neither of their families ever spoke about openly. One entry, dated years before Elena was born, stopped her breath entirely. If anything ever happens to me, I want my daughter to know love the way I knew it with my husband. Not obligation, not debt. Real love, the kind that chooses you every single day, even when choosing is difficult. Elena closed the journal slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother had wanted this for her, had wanted real love built on choice rather than obligation. And somewhere in this strange, complicated arrangement, Elena realized she was beginning to feel exactly that, despite everything working against it. She found Damien in the garden again, a place that seemed to have become their unspoken meeting ground for difficult conversations. He looked up when she approached, his expression cautious, as though bracing for whatever decision she had reached. "I read something my mother wrote," Elena said, sitting down beside him. "About love, about choosing someone every day, regardless of how it starts." Damien remained silent, watching her carefully. "I don't know what this is yet," Elena continued. "I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just confusion caused by everything happening so fast. But I know I don't want to spend the rest of this year afraid of you or resentful of how it started. I want to actually try, Damien, to see what this could become, without the weight of promises and debts hanging over every moment." Something in Damien's expression shifted, relief and hope mixing together in a way that made him look younger, less burdened than she had ever seen him. "I would like that," he said quietly, "more than you know." For the first time since arriving in this house, Elena reached out first, her hand finding his without hesitation. Damien's fingers curled around hers gently, and they sat together in the fading evening light, two people slowly choosing each other despite everything that had brought them to this moment. But even as hope began to bloom between them, Elena could not shake the memory of Victor's cold smile, the way he had mentioned her mother's memory, with such calculated cruelty. Whatever remained hidden in the shadows of this family's history, she had a growing feeling that Victor knew more than he had let on, and that his interest in their marriage went far deeper than simple curiosity. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their quiet garden, a storm was gathering, one neither Elena nor Damien could yet see clearly. And when it finally broke, it would test everything they had begun to build between them, forcing both to decide whether the fragile trust they had built was strong enough to survive the truth still waiting to be uncovered. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, plain and unmarked, slipped under the front gate sometime before dawn. Grace brought it to Elena with a worried frown, saying she had never seen anything delivered that way before, without a courier, without a name, as though someone had walked up to the estate in the middle of the night just to leave it there. Elena opened it alone in her room, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, but the words themselves carried a coldness that made her stomach twist. "Ask your husband what really happened to his father's business partner. Ask him why the man disappeared the same year Damien inherited everything. Some debts are paid in more than money, Mrs. Cole." There was no signature, but Elena did not need one to know exactly who had sent it. Victor's cold smile flashed through her mind, along with the calculated way he had mentioned Damien's father at the restaurant. She read the note 3 more times, her heart pounding harder with each pass, before folding it carefully and tucking it into her pocket. She spent the rest of the day distracted, unable to focus on anything, her mind circling back again and again to the accusation hidden within those few short lines. When Damien returned home that evening, she watched him more closely than usual, searching his familiar expressions for any hint of the darkness Victor's note suggested. "You're quiet tonight," Damien observed over dinner, setting down his fork to study her carefully. "Is something wrong?" Elena hesitated, torn between confronting him directly and waiting to gather more information first. But the weight of the secret felt too heavy to carry alone, and she found herself pulling the folded note from her pocket, sliding it across the table without a word. Damien's expression changed the moment he read it, the color draining slowly from his face. "Where did you get this?" "Someone left it at the gate last night," Elena said. "Damien, is it true? What happened to your father's business partner?" For a long moment, Damien said nothing, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though trying to steady himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Elena had ever heard it. His name was Walter, Damien said. He and my father built the business together, from nothing, back when I was still a child. But my father made choices that put the company at risk, choices Walter disagreed with completely. There was a falling out, right before my father died. Walter disappeared shortly after, and no one ever found out exactly why. And people think you had something to do with it. Damien's jaw tightened. Victor has spent years trying to convince people of exactly that. He was close with Walter, back before everything fell apart. He's never forgiven me for inheriting the business Walter believed should have been split between them. Did you have something to do with it? Elena asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Hurt flashed across Damien's face, sharp and sudden. No, he said firmly. I was 17 years old when Walter disappeared, Elena. I had nothing to do with whatever happened to him. But Victor doesn't care about the truth. He cares about destroying everything I've built, and he's been searching for a way to do that for years. Elena studied him carefully, weighing his words against the note still sitting on the table between them. Something in his eyes convinced her he was telling the truth, but the seed of doubt Victor had planted refused to fully disappear. Why does he want to destroy you so badly? She asked. Damien was quiet for a long moment before answering, because when Walter disappeared, the company should have legally passed to his family as much as mine. My father found a way around that, a loophole that kept everything under our name alone. Victor believes I benefited from whatever happened to Walter, even though I had no part in it. He's spent years trying to prove some kind of conspiracy that simply doesn't exist. And now he's involving me, Elena said quietly, using our marriage as a way to get closer to whatever he's trying to prove. Damien reached across the table, taking her hand gently. I won't let him hurt you, Elena. Whatever games Victor is playing, I promise you, you're not part of them, not if I can help it. Despite his reassurance, Elena could not shake the unease settling in her chest. Over the following days, more notes arrived, each one carrying a different accusation, a different piece of half-truth, designed to plant doubt in her mind. Damien grew more protective, more watchful, canceling meetings, and staying closer to home than he had since her arrival. One evening, as Elena sat in the study reading, a soft knock startled her from her thoughts. Grace stood in the doorway, her expression grave. There's a woman at the gate, Grace said carefully. She's asking for you specifically, Mrs. Cole. Says her name is Nora, and that she knew your mother. Elena's heart skipped. She had not heard that name in years, not since her mother's funeral, when a young woman she barely remembered had offered condolences before disappearing into the crowd. Curious and cautious in equal measure, Elena made her way to the front gate, finding a woman with kind eyes and worried features, waiting patiently on the other side. Elena, Nora said softly, I know this is strange, showing up unannounced like this, but I heard about your marriage, and I felt I owed it to your mother to make sure you knew the full truth before it was too late. The full truth about what? Elena asked, her stomach tightening with dread. Nora glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. About the Cole family, about what really happened all those years ago. Your mother knew things, Elena, things she never told you, to protect you. But I think it's time someone finally did. Elena's mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them comforting. Please, she said, tell me. Nora hesitated, glancing back toward the grand house behind Elena, as though afraid of being overheard. Not here, she said. Somewhere private. There are things about Damien's father, about the deal he made with your mother, that changed everything between our families. Things that involve more than just a simple promise of friendship. A cold chill ran down Elena's spine. Whatever truth Nora carried, it felt far heavier than anything Damien had shared with her so far, and she found herself torn between the growing trust she had built with her husband and the nagging fear that perhaps that trust had been built on an incomplete foundation. I need to think, Elena said slowly. This is a lot to process. Nora nodded understandingly, pressing a small piece of paper into Elena's hand, an address scrawled across it in careful handwriting. Whenever you're ready, she said, I'll be waiting. Just be careful who you trust in that house, Elena. Not everyone there has your best interests at heart. Elena watched Nora disappear down the long driveway, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She looked back at the grand estate behind her, at the warm light glowing from the study window, where Damien likely still sat reading, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place at his front gate. For the first time since choosing to trust him fully, Elena felt the weight of uncertainty settle back over her shoulders. Somewhere between Victor's cold accusations and Nora's cryptic warning, the truth about Damien Cole's past remained frustratingly out of reach, buried beneath years of secrets and unspoken promises. She folded the small piece of paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket, her mind already turning toward the difficult decision waiting ahead. Whatever truth existed behind the walls of this complicated family history, Elena understood now that she could not simply wait for Damien to reveal it on his own timeline. The time had come to seek out the truth herself, regardless of where that search might lead her, or what it might ultimately cost the fragile trust she had worked so hard to build. The small cafe Nora had chosen sat tucked away on a quiet side street, far from the polished world Elena had grown used to since her marriage. She arrived early, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking, her mind racing through every possible version of the truth she was about to hear. Nora arrived a few minutes later, sliding into the seat across from her, with a cautious glance around the nearly empty cafe. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this can't be easy, given everything." "Just tell me," Elena said, unable to bear any more waiting. "Please." Nora took a slow breath before beginning. "Your mother and Damien's mother were closer than simple friends, Elena. They were business partners in a way. Before either of them married, they started a small investment together, using savings they had both scraped together over years of careful work. That investment grew, slowly at first, and eventually became part of the foundation that helped build the Cole family business." Elena's mind raced to process this new information. "My mother helped build Damien's family fortune?" "In part, yes," Nora confirmed. "But when Damien's father took over full control of the business after marrying his mother, he found ways to slowly push your mother's involvement out of the official records. He convinced her it was simpler that way, safer for everyone involved, especially once complications arose with other business partners." "Walter," Elena whispered, remembering the name Damien had mentioned. Nora nodded. Walter suspected something wasn't right with how the ownership was being recorded. He began asking questions, right before he disappeared. Your mother always believed his disappearance had something to do with those questions, though she could never prove anything conclusively. The weight of the accusation settled heavily in Elena's chest. "Are you saying Damien's father did something to Walter?" "I don't know for certain," Nora admitted. "No one does. Not really. But your mother spent years afterward making sure the small percentage of ownership she still legally held remained protected, hidden within legal documents most people never bothered to examine closely. She believed that ownership might one day matter, might one day need to be used to protect you, should anything ever happen to your father's business." Elena sat back in her chair, trying to absorb the enormity of what she was hearing. "Are you telling me I actually own part of Damien's company?" "A small percentage," Nora confirmed. "Buried in old paperwork most people have long forgotten about. I only know because your mother told me herself, shortly before she passed away. She made me promise to tell you, if the situation ever called for it. And given your current marriage, I believe that time has come." The revelation left Elena reeling. If what Nora said was true, then her marriage to Damien was tangled in far more complicated history than either of them had fully understood. It meant Gerald, the lawyer who arranged everything, might have known details neither she nor Damien had been told. It meant Victor's accusations, however cruel in delivery, might carry a grain of uncomfortable truth buried beneath his calculated cruelty. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elena asked. "Why not sooner?" Nora's expression softened with something like regret. "Because I saw the announcement of your marriage, and I worried. Worried that Damien's family, knowingly or not, might be using this arrangement to finally erase whatever remaining claim your family holds on that business. I couldn't let that happen without at least warning you first." Elena's mind spun with 1,000 new questions, each one more complicated than the last. She thanked Nora carefully, promising to consider everything she had shared, before making her way back toward the estate, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and betrayal. When she arrived home, she found Damien waiting in the entryway, his expression immediately shifting to concern the moment he saw her face. "Elena, what's wrong? Where have you been?" "I need to ask you something," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I need you to be completely honest with me, Damien. No more careful half-truths." Damien's brow furrowed with worry, but he nodded slowly. "Of course. Anything. Did you know my mother held partial ownership in your family's business? A percentage that was quietly pushed out of the official records after your father took control?" The color drained from Damien's face so completely that Elena had her answer before he even spoke a word. "How did you find out about that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then it's true," Elena said, her heart sinking despite already suspecting the answer. "You knew." "I only found out recently," Damien said quickly, stepping closer. "Elena, please, let me explain. When Gerald first came to me about your father's debt, he mentioned the old ownership records almost in passing. I didn't fully understand their significance until after we were already married, after Gerald explained the full history to me privately." "And you didn't think that was important to tell me?" Elena's voice rose slightly, betrayal cutting sharper than she expected. "I was going to," Damien insisted. "I was building up to it, trying to find the right way to explain everything without overwhelming you all at once. Elena, I know how this looks, but I promise you, I have no intention of hiding what rightfully belongs to your family." Elena studied him carefully, torn between the desperate honesty in his eyes and the growing fear that perhaps this entire marriage had been constructed around motives far more complicated than a simple promise between mothers. "What about Walter?" she asked quietly. "What really happened to him?" Damien's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent years trying to find answers myself, Elena. My father never spoke about what happened, and by the time I was old enough to ask real questions, he was already gone. I know it looks suspicious. I know Victor has built an entire narrative around it, but I promise you, I am not hiding some terrible secret about Walter's disappearance." The desperate sincerity in his voice warred against the growing doubt Nora's revelations had planted in Elena's mind. She wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to trust the man who had spent weeks proving himself gentle and thoughtful in 100 small ways. But the tangled web of secrets surrounding their families felt too large, too dangerous, to simply accept on faith alone. "I need time," Elena said finally, echoing the words she had spoken once before. "This is too much, Damien. I need time to think through everything." Damien's shoulders sagged with quiet devastation, but he nodded slowly. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I meant what I promised you, Elena. I'm not going anywhere, no matter how long it takes you to decide whether you can trust me." That night, Elena lay awake long after Damien had fallen into restless sleep beside her, her mind replaying every conversation, every revelation, every careful gesture he had shown her since her arrival. She thought about the notebook filled with small kindnesses, the sheet music he had given her, the honest vulnerability in his eyes when he spoke about his mother's promise. But she also thought about Walter, vanishing without explanation, about her mother's ownership, quietly erased from official records, about Victor's cold warning and Nora's careful revelations, each piece adding weight to a puzzle that refused to form a clear picture. Somewhere beyond the walls of this grand, complicated house, the truth still waited, patient and heavy, and Elena understood now that uncovering it fully would require more courage than she had needed for anything else in her entire life. Whatever answer waited at the end of this search, she had a growing feeling it would change everything, not just about the marriage she had entered so reluctantly, but about the man she had slowly, cautiously, begun to fall for despite every reason not to. Gerald's office looked different in the harsh light of morning, less intimidating than it had felt the day Elena first learned of her father's debt. She sat across from him now, a folder of old documents spread between them, her heart pounding as she waited for him to explain what he had found. "Your mother's ownership was never fully removed," Gerald said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the papers. "Legally, it still exists, buried beneath decades of amendments and restructuring. A small percentage, but enough to matter, especially given recent developments in the company's growth." "So Nora was telling the truth," Elena said quietly. "It appears so," Gerald confirmed. Though I want to be clear, Mrs. Cole, I only recently discovered the full extent of this myself. When I first arranged the settlement between your father and Mr. Cole, I was not aware of this deeper history. Had I known, I might have advised differently. Elena studied the documents carefully, her mind racing through the implications. If her mother's ownership still legally existed, then technically, she herself now held a claim to part of the very company Damien had built his entire identity around. "Does Damien know the full extent of this?" she asked. "I explained it to him shortly after your wedding," Gerald admitted. He seemed genuinely surprised by the details, though I cannot speak to what he knew before that conversation. Elena thanked Gerald and left his office with more questions than answers, the folder of documents clutched tightly against her chest. As she stepped outside into the busy street, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, something instinctive warning her before she even heard the voice on the other end. "Mrs. Cole," Victor's smooth voice greeted her. "I was hoping we might speak privately, away from your husband's watchful eyes." Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want, Victor?" "Just a conversation," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "I think it's time you learned the full truth about the man you married. Meet me this afternoon, and I'll show you evidence that will finally answer every question you've been asking." Every instinct told Elena to refuse, to hang up immediately and warn Damien about this call, but the desperate need for answers, for clarity in the midst of so much uncertainty, proved stronger than her caution. "Where?" she asked. Victor gave her an address, a small building on the outskirts of the city, and Elena found herself agreeing, before fully considering the wisdom of meeting alone, with a man who had shown nothing but calculated cruelty since the moment she met him. The building turned out to be an old storage facility, quiet and mostly abandoned, filled with the kind of shadows that made Elena's skin crawl the moment she stepped inside. Victor waited for her in a small office near the entrance, a folder of his own spread across a dusty desk. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "I know this must feel strange, meeting somewhere so far from the comfort of your new home." "Just show me what you claim to have," Elena said, refusing to sit down. Victor's smile widened, cold and calculating. "Very well." He slid a photograph across the desk, an old image showing two men shaking hands outside a building Elena did not recognize. "That's Walter, meeting with my father shortly before he disappeared." They had discovered something troubling about the company's finances, something Damien's father had been hiding for years. "What kind of something?" Elena asked, despite every instinct warning her to leave immediately. "Embezzlement," Victor said simply. Damien's father had been quietly moving funds for years, funds that should have belonged equally to Walter and to your mother, given her early investment. Walter threatened to expose everything, and then he simply vanished. Elena's stomach twisted painfully. "And you believe Damien's father had something to do with that disappearance?" "I believe Damien's entire fortune was built on a foundation of theft and silence," Victor said, his calm demeanor cracking just slightly to reveal genuine anger underneath. "And I believe Damien has known the truth for years, choosing silence over justice, because that silence benefits him directly." "That's not true," a voice said sharply from the doorway. Elena spun around to find Damien standing there, his expression a mixture of fury and fear, his eyes locked directly on Victor. "Damien," Elena breathed, relief and confusion crashing together inside her chest. "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "Grace called me the moment you left with that folder," Damien said, not taking his eyes off Victor. "I've been trying to reach you for the last hour." Victor rose slowly from his chair, unbothered by Damien's sudden appearance. "Ah, right on time. I was just explaining to your wife the truth about your father's legacy." "You don't know the truth," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've spent years building a story that fits your own bitterness, Victor, without any real evidence to support it." "I have evidence," Victor snapped, gesturing toward the photograph still sitting on the desk. "Enough to finally expose everything your family has hidden for decades." "Then why haven't you?" Damien challenged. "If you truly had proof, Victor, you would have used it years ago. Instead, you've spent your time sending anonymous notes and cornering my wife, when I wasn't around, to protect her." Something flickered across Victor's face, a brief crack in his confident mask. Because the proof isn't complete, he admitted reluctantly. Not yet, but I'm close. Closer than you realize. Then we're done here, Damien said firmly, reaching for Elena's hand. Elena, we're leaving. Elena hesitated for just a moment, glancing between the two men, before allowing Damien to guide her toward the exit. Victor's voice followed them, sharp and final. This isn't over, Damien. I will find the truth, one way or another, and when I do, everyone will finally see the man you really are. Once they were safely in the car, driving away from the abandoned building, Elena finally allowed herself to breathe properly. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I shouldn't have gone alone. It was foolish. I understand why you did, Damien said, his hands still tight on the steering wheel. You needed answers, and I haven't been giving them to you fast enough. That's my fault, not yours. Is any of what he said true? Elena asked. About embezzlement? About Walter? Damien's expression grew troubled. I don't know, he admitted honestly. I've spent years wondering about my father's true character, Elena. He wasn't a simple man. He made choices I still don't fully understand, choices that hurt people, including your mother, including possibly Walter. But I don't believe he was capable of the kind of violence Victor seems to be implying. How can you be certain? I can't be, completely, Damien admitted, but I intend to find out the truth, once and for all, not just for my own peace of mind, but for yours as well. You deserve to know exactly what your mother sacrificed, and exactly what role my family played in whatever happened to Walter. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any trace of deception, but found only exhausted determination staring back at her. Whatever secrets remained buried in their family's complicated history, she understood now that both of them were caught in the same tangled web, both searching desperately for a truth that seemed determined to remain hidden. That evening, as they sat together in the study, surrounded by old documents and faded photographs, Damien reached for her hand across the desk. Whatever we find, he said quietly, I want you to know that none of it changes how I feel about you. This started as a debt of honor, Elena, but it became something real weeks ago. I need you to believe that, regardless of what the truth turns out to be. Elena squeezed his hand gently, allowing herself, for just a moment, to set aside the fear and uncertainty swirling around them. I believe you, she said softly. Now, let's find out the truth together, so we can finally stop looking over our shoulders. Outside, the night grew darker, and somewhere in the city, Victor continued his search for evidence that would either confirm his darkest accusations or finally lay them to rest. Neither Elena nor Damien knew which outcome awaited them, but for the first time since the secrets began unraveling, they faced the uncertainty together, rather than each carrying the weight alone. The old storage unit smelled of dust and forgotten years, boxes stacked haphazardly against every wall, each one labeled in handwriting Damien recognized immediately as his father's. He had inherited the unit along with everything else, but had never once found the courage to open it, too afraid of what memories might be waiting inside. Are you certain about this? Elena asked, standing beside him in the dim light filtering through a single dusty window. No, Damien admitted, but I can't keep running from the truth any longer, not when it affects you as much as it affects me. Together, they began sorting through the boxes, each one revealing pieces of a past neither of them fully understood. Old business records, faded photographs, letters written in handwriting growing increasingly unsteady toward the end. Hours passed before Elena's fingers closed around a small leather journal, tucked beneath a stack of financial documents near the bottom of the final box. Damien, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I think this is it. Damien took the journal carefully, his hands shaking as he opened the worn cover. His father's handwriting filled the pages, growing messier with each entry, the words themselves carrying a weight of guilt Damien had never known existed. Walter discovered the missing funds today. I told him it was a mistake in the accounting, but he doesn't believe me. He's right not to. I took money that wasn't mine, money that belonged to Elena's mother, as much as to Walter. I told myself it was temporary, that I would return it once the business stabilized. But the debts only grew larger, and I grew more desperate to hide what I had done. Elena read over his shoulder, her breath catching at every word. Damien continued turning pages, his expression growing more devastated with each entry, until he reached one dated just days before Walter's disappearance. Walter confronted me today. He said he would expose everything unless I agreed to return what I had taken, plus interest, enough to ruin me completely. I panicked. I said things I shouldn't have said, threats I never intended to follow through on. He left angry, saying he needed time to think before deciding what to do next. I haven't heard from him since. I pray he simply needed space to cool down, that he hasn't done something rash. But the guilt is unbearable. If anything has happened to him, I will never forgive myself. The final entries grew increasingly desperate, Damien's father searching frantically for any sign of Walter, growing more paranoid with each passing week that his threats had somehow driven Walter to do something terrible to himself. Though no body was ever found, no clear evidence uncovered. I have decided the only way to atone for what I've done is to make sure Elena's family and Walter's family, should he ever return, never suffer for my mistakes. I will quietly protect their interests, even if I cannot undo the damage already caused. Damien must never know the full truth. I cannot bear for my son to see me as the man I truly am. Damien closed the journal slowly, tears he did not attempt to hide sliding down his face. He didn't hurt Walter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He drove him away with his mistakes, with his desperation to fix what he had broken, but he didn't hurt him, not directly. Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Where do you think Walter went? I don't know, Damien admitted. But this changes everything, Elena. My father wasn't a monster. He was a man who made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to quietly make amends, too ashamed to admit the truth, even to himself. They spent the rest of the evening searching through the remaining boxes, eventually uncovering a series of financial records showing careful, anonymous payments made over the years toward what appeared to be a hidden account, an account Gerald later confirmed had been established specifically to protect Elena's mother's ownership interests, exactly as the journal described. Armed with this new evidence, Damien arranged a private meeting with Victor the following week, insisting Elena accompany him. They met in Damien's own study this time, the familiar surroundings offering a sense of control that had been missing during their previous encounter. I found the truth, Damien said, sliding the journal across the desk toward Victor. My father embezzled funds, yes. He made terrible choices that hurt your father and Elena's mother. But he did not harm Walter. He drove him away with his own guilt and desperation, and then spent the rest of his life quietly trying to atone for it. Victor read through the journal slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more complicated as the evidence became undeniable. This doesn't explain where my father actually went, he said finally, though the anger in his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. No, Damien agreed. But it proves he wasn't murdered, wasn't silenced through violence. Whatever happened to him after he left that final conversation with my father, it was his own choice, born from anger and betrayal, not from any harm my family caused directly. Victor sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the journal, years of bitter certainty crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. I spent my entire life believing my father was murdered, he finally said, his voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it. Believing your family took everything from mine through violence, not just betrayal. I understand the anger that created, Damien said carefully. I felt something similar, discovering my own father's guilt. But Victor, we can't keep punishing each other for choices neither of us made. Let this end here, with the truth finally out in the open. Elena watched the tension slowly drain from Victor's shoulders, replaced by something closer to exhaustion than anger. What about the missing funds? He asked. The money my father was owed, before everything fell apart? I intend to make things right, Damien said firmly. Elena's ownership will be fully restored and properly documented, and I will personally ensure your father's estate receives fair compensation for what was taken, regardless of how many years have passed. Victor studied Damien carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but finding only sincere determination. Why would you do that? You could simply bury this evidence, deny everything, and continue as though this conversation never happened. Because I'm tired of carrying secrets that were never mine to protect, Damien said quietly. And because Elena deserves a husband who chooses honesty, even when it's difficult. Something shifted in Victor's expression, years of bitter resentment finally beginning to loosen their grip. I'll need time to process all of this, he admitted. But I appreciate your honesty, Damien. More than you probably realize. As Victor left the study, the weight that had hung over the house for weeks finally began to lift. Elena turned to Damien, relief and admiration mixing together in her chest, as she studied the man who had chosen truth over comfortable silence, despite everything it cost him personally. You didn't have to tell him everything, she said softly. You could have protected your father's memory a little longer. My father spent his whole life hiding behind silence, Damien said, pulling her gently into his arms. I refuse to make that same mistake, especially not with you. Not anymore. Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling more certain than ever that whatever complicated history had brought them together, the connection growing between them now was built on something far more solid than obligation or debt. What happens now? She asked. Damien pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes with a warmth that made her chest ache with something dangerously close to love. Now, he said softly, we figure out what we actually want, free from secrets and inherited guilt. Together, if you're willing. Elena smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had allowed herself since arriving in this house so many weeks ago. I'm willing, she said, more than willing. Outside, the evening settled peacefully over the estate, the storm that had gathered for weeks finally passing, leaving behind clearer skies and the fragile, precious beginning of something neither of them had expected to find within the confines of an arrangement built on debt and obligation. Winter arrived quietly over the estate, dusting the rose garden with a thin layer of frost that made the flowers look like delicate glass sculptures under the pale morning light. Elena stood at the window of what had once felt like a stranger's house, and now felt entirely like home, watching Damien outside, carefully wrapping burlap around the most fragile of his mother's roses to protect them from the coming cold. 9 months had passed since the day she first walked through that iron gate, terrified and certain she was stepping into a life of quiet suffering. Now, watching her husband work in the frozen garden with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered to him, Elena could hardly recognize the frightened young woman she had once been. The truth about Walter had eventually reached a peaceful, if incomplete, resolution. A private investigator, hired jointly by Damien and Victor, had discovered that Walter had quietly moved to another country entirely, living under a different name, choosing to disappear rather than face the pain of his broken partnership. He had passed away peacefully several years earlier, leaving behind a small family who had no idea of the complicated history connected to their father's early life. Victor had traveled to meet them personally, finally finding the closure he had spent decades searching for. Elena's ownership in the company had been fully restored, documented properly this time, protected by careful legal work that ensured no future generation would ever have to untangle such a complicated web of secrets again. She had chosen not to take an active role in the business itself, content instead to focus on rebuilding her father's furniture company, using her newfound resources to help it grow beyond anything her father had ever imagined possible. Her father, once burdened by shame and debt, had slowly transformed into a man Elena barely recognized from those difficult early days. He visited often, always bringing small gifts for Damien, the two men slowly building an unlikely friendship over shared woodworking projects in the estate's spacious garage, something Elena watched with quiet joy every time she happened upon them there, covered in sawdust, laughing over some shared joke. You're thinking too hard again, Damien said, startling her from her thoughts as he entered the room, his cheeks flushed from the cold outside. I can always tell when you disappear into your own head like that. Elena smiled, crossing the room to help him remove his heavy coat. Just remembering how different everything felt, this time last year. Damien's expression softened, memories of their difficult beginning passing briefly across his face. We've come a long way, he agreed, pulling her gently into his arms. Do you remember what you told me, that very first month? Elena asked, resting her head against his chest. About learning who I was? before anything else happened between us? I remember, Damien said quietly. I was terrified you would see right through me, would realize how uncertain I really was, despite everything my reputation suggested. I think that's what made me trust you, Elena admitted. You never tried to rush anything, you just learned me. Patiently, carefully, like I actually mattered, beyond whatever the contract required. Damien pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes with the same quiet intensity she had grown to love so deeply over these months together. You did matter, he said. You do matter, Elena, more than any contract, any debt, any promise made before either of us was even born. The contract, the original year-long agreement that had brought them together under such complicated circumstances, had technically expired just weeks ago. Neither of them had mentioned it directly, both quietly understanding that whatever they had built together no longer depended on legal obligation. They stayed because they chose to stay, each morning a fresh decision built on genuine affection rather than inherited duty. I have something for you, Damien said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box. Elena's breath caught as he opened it, revealing not the elaborate wedding ring she already wore, but a simple, delicate band, elegant in its understated beauty. Damien, what is this? A promise, he said softly, taking her hand carefully. Not the kind made out of debt or obligation, not the kind made between our mothers, all those years ago, before either of us understood what real love actually required. This is a promise I'm making entirely on my own, freely, because I choose you, Elena. Every single day, for as long as you'll have me. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she watched him slip the ring onto her finger, beside the one that had marked the beginning of their complicated, unexpected journey together. I choose you too, she whispered. I think I've been choosing you for months now, even before I fully understood what that meant. Outside, snow began falling gently over the garden, dusting the protected roses in soft white powder, the same garden where Damien had first shown her the vulnerable, gentle heart, hiding beneath his carefully constructed reputation. Elena thought about her mother's journal entry, the wish for real love built on daily choice rather than obligation, and felt overwhelming gratitude that somehow, against every difficult circumstance that had brought them together, that exact wish had come true. Grace found them there later that evening, still wrapped in each other's arms by the window, watching the snow continue its quiet descent over the estate. She smiled warmly, saying nothing, simply setting down a tray of tea before quietly retreating, leaving the couple to their peaceful, well-earned happiness. Years later, when people asked Elena how her marriage began, she would tell them the truth, unashamed of the complicated circumstances that had brought her and Damien together. She would tell them about the debt, about the fear, about the careful month Damien spent learning every small detail about her, before ever asking for anything more. She would tell them about secrets uncovered and trust rebuilt, about two families finally finding peace after decades of hidden guilt. But mostly, she would tell them about a quiet garden filled with roses, about a man who chose patience over pressure, about a love that began as obligation but transformed, slowly and carefully, into something entirely real. Something neither of them had expected to find, but both had ultimately been brave enough to accept, choosing each other freely, one gentle day at a time, until choosing became simply another word for love. And in that grand old house, once filled with silence and secrets, laughter finally became the sound that echoed loudest through every hallway, carrying with it the quiet, hard-won proof that sometimes, the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most enduring kind of love.